The moment I entered my wedding hall, I saw my sister sitting in my spot beside my fiancé. My mother grabbed my arm and hissed, "Don't you dare cause a scene, or we'll have you dragged out like the embarrassment you are." My sister smirked. "Come here, sis. I have something special to show you." As I approached, she spit directly in my face, laughing. "Here's what happens to pathetic women who can't satisfy their own men." My fiancé stood up and declared, "Get lost, you worthless piece of trash. We found real love." The entire venue erupted in laughter, phones recording my humiliation. I stayed calm and made one move that left them in ruins. I still remember that Saturday morning in April when I woke up thinking it would be the happiest day of my life. After 2 years of planning, my wedding to Reed was finally here. The venue was perfect. The flowers were arranged exactly as I'd envisioned. And my dress, a vintage lace gown that had belonged to my grandmother, was pressed and ready. I should have known something was wrong when my sister Morgan didn't answer her phone that morning. She was supposed to be my maid of honor. Let me back up and explain the dynamic in my family. I'm Talia, 28 years old, and I've always been what you might call the responsible one. I worked 2 jobs to put myself through college, saved every penny for this wedding, and somehow managed to land a decent guy like Reed, a software engineer who treated me well and shared our dreams of starting a family. My sister Morgan, 2 years younger, was always the golden child. Prettier, more outgoing, and with a talent for getting what she wanted without working for it. My mother, Celeste, made no secret about which daughter she preferred. Growing up, I watched Morgan get everything handed to her. The better birthday parties, the nicer clothes, the car when she turned 16, while I took the bus. When I started dating Reed 3 years ago, Morgan made several comments about how she could do better and that Reed was settling for me. I brushed it off as typical sister rivalry, but I should have paid more attention to the warning signs. The first red flag came 6 months before the wedding when I caught Morgan and Reed having what looked like an intimate conversation at my birthday party. When I asked Reed about it later, he said Morgan was just being friendly and asking about wedding planning. The second red flag was when Morgan insisted on helping with wedding preparations but kept making suggestions that would fundamentally change everything I wanted. She pushed for a different venue, different flowers, different everything. When I stood my ground, she pouted and complained to our mother, who would then pressure me to compromise with my sister. But the biggest red flag came 2 months before the wedding. I was working late at the office when I realized I'd forgotten some contracts I needed to review. I drove back to get them and saw Reed's car in the parking lot across from a restaurant. Through the window, I could see him having dinner with Morgan. They were holding hands across the table. When I confronted Reed the next day, he had an explanation. Morgan was helping him plan a surprise for me, and I needed to stop being so paranoid and jealous. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. So I pushed down the growing knot in my stomach and focused on the final wedding preparations. The morning of the wedding, I got ready at my apartment with my best friend and college roommate, Kendra. She'd flown in from Portland to be my maid of honor after Morgan mysteriously became too busy with her job at the boutique. Kendra kept asking where Morgan was, and I kept making excuses. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I arrived at the venue, Riverside Gardens, a beautiful outdoor space with a Victorian-style chapel, at 2 p.m. for our 4 p.m. ceremony. The parking lot was already full, which seemed strange since guests weren't supposed to arrive until 3:30. My stomach dropped when I saw Morgan's bright red Mustang parked right next to Reed's sedan. I walked through the chapel doors in my wedding dress, expecting to see the usual pre-ceremony chaos. Vendors making final adjustments, maybe some early arriving guests being seated. Reed and his groomsmen getting ready in the side room. Instead, I walked into what looked like a ceremony already in progress. Morgan was sitting in the front row, in the spot reserved for the bride, wearing a white cocktail dress that was entirely inappropriate for someone else's wedding. She was holding Reed's hand while he stood at the altar in his tuxedo, the exact same tuxedo he was supposed to wear for our ceremony. The officiant, Reverend Morrison, whom I'd met with 3 times to plan our service, was standing behind them with an open Bible. For a moment, the entire room went silent. I could see our relatives, Reed's family, our mutual friends, all staring at me with expressions that ranged from guilty to amused to downright hostile. My cousin Olivia was recording everything on her phone. My Aunt Margaret whispered something to her husband, and they both laughed. It was then that my mother materialized beside me. Celeste grabbed my arm so hard I could feel her nails through the lace sleeve of my dress. She leaned in close and hissed in my ear, "Don't you dare cause a scene, or we'll have you bragged out like the embarrassment you are." I stared at her in shock. This was my wedding, my venue, my flowers, my deposit, my caterer, my photographer. My family was treating me like I was crashing someone else's party. Morgan turned around and smiled at me, and it was the most cruel smile I'd ever seen. She gestured for me to come closer. "Come here, sis, I have something special to show you." Every instinct told me to run, but I was trapped by disbelief and the crowd of people watching. I walked down the aisle I was supposed to walk down as a bride, still in my wedding dress, toward my sister who was wearing white and holding my fiancé's hand. When I got close enough, Morgan stood up. She was still smiling that horrible smile. Then she spit directly in my face. The saliva hit my cheek and dripped down onto my grandmother's lace dress. "Here's what happens to pathetic women who can't satisfy their own men." She laughed, and several people in the crowd actually applauded. I stood there, spit on my face in my wedding dress, while my sister sat back down and grabbed Reed's hand again. It was then that Reed stood up and looked directly at me. "Get lost, you worthless piece of trash. We found real love." The entire venue erupted in laughter. I could hear phones coming out, camera shutters clicking, people recording videos. My humiliation was being documented for social media. I could already imagine the Facebook posts. "Can you believe what happened at Talia's wedding? Morgan and Reed are so perfect together. Talia totally deserved this." My Aunt Margaret called out, "Finally, Reed came to his senses." My cousin Wesley yelled, "Morgan's way hotter." Even Reed's own brother Dylan was laughing and shaking his head like this was the best entertainment he'd seen all year. But here's the thing about being humiliated in front of everyone you know. It clarifies things. Standing there with spit on my face, watching everyone I thought cared about me laughing at my pain, I realized I had absolutely nothing left to lose. And when you have nothing left to lose, you become very, very dangerous. I stayed calm. I wiped the spit off my face with the back of my hand. I looked around the room at all these people who thought they were watching my downfall. Then I smiled. I walked back toward the chapel doors, pulled out my phone, and made one call. Not to cry to a friend or beg Reed to reconsider. I called my lawyer. But before I tell you about that call, let me explain how I got to this point. Because while everyone was laughing at what they thought was my demise, they had no idea that I'd been preparing for this exact scenario for 2 months. 2 months earlier, when I saw Reed and Morgan at that restaurant, I didn't just go home and cry. I went home and got suspicious. Really suspicious. I started paying attention to things I'd been ignoring, and what I found made my blood run cold. The first thing I discovered was that Reed had been lying about working late. I called his office on one of those nights when he claimed to be pulling an all-nighter, and the security guard told me the building had been empty since 6 p.m. When I drove by Morgan's apartment that same night, Reed's car was parked outside.
The second thing I found was a credit card statement that had been mailed to my address but addressed to Morgan. She'd been using my address to open accounts for months, racking up debt on shopping sprees and expensive dinners. Dinners that I realized she'd been having with Reed while I was working late to pay for our wedding. The third discovery was the most devastating. I found a group chat on Reed's phone when he left it on my kitchen counter to shower. It was him, Morgan, and several of their mutual friends, including people I considered my friends. They'd been planning this humiliation for weeks, discussing exactly how they wanted it to play out, sharing jokes about how pathetic I was going to look. One message from Morgan particularly stuck with me. I can't wait to see Talia's face when she realizes everyone knows what a loser she is. Reed and I are going to be so happy together, and she's going to be alone forever. Reed had responded, "She's going to cry so hard, it's going to be hilarious." My friend Beth, who I'd known since high school, had written, "I'm definitely recording this. It's going to be the best thing on my Instagram story." Even my cousin Wesley had chimed in, "About time Reed upgraded. Morgan's way out of Talia's league." Reading those messages, I realized that this wasn't just about Reed and Morgan betraying Lee. This was about my entire social circle conspiring to humiliate me for their entertainment. They weren't just attending my wedding, they were attending my destruction, and they were excited about it.
That night, I sat in my apartment and cried for exactly 1 hour. I let myself feel the full weight of the betrayal, the hurt, the shock of discovering that people I trusted had been plotting against me. Then I dried my tears, made myself a cup of coffee, and got to work. The first thing I did was document everything. I printed out all the credit card statements Morgan had fraudulently obtained using my address. I took screenshots of the group chat before Reed could delete it. I started recording conversations in situations where I legally could, such as when they called me, or when we met in public places where there was no expectation of privacy. The recordings were even worse than the texts. Morgan talked to Reed about how they were going to break Talia completely and make sure she never recovers from this. Reed discussed how he'd been faking it with me for months and couldn't wait to be with someone who is actually attractive. My mother, my own mother, talked about how she'd always known Morgan was the better daughter and how this wedding switch would finally put Talia in her place. They weren't just planning to humiliate me, they were planning to destroy my entire sense of self-worth, my reputation, my social connections. They wanted to make sure I had nothing left. But here's what they didn't understand about me. I don't break. I get even. The second thing I did was research. I spent hours reading about contract law, fraud, breach of promise, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I learned about mail fraud penalties, credit fraud consequences, and what constitutes conspiracy to commit fraud. I studied every legal avenue available to me. The third thing I did was plan, not just my revenge, but my exit strategy. I couldn't just destroy them and then continue living the same life. I needed to be ready to start over completely. So I updated my resume, reached out to headhunters in other cities, and started looking at apartments in Portland where Kendra lived. I also did something that turned out to be crucial. I hired a private investigator named Logan Vega. Logan was recommended by Nina, my lawyer, and he was worth every penny. I gave him 2 months to dig up everything he could on Reed, Morgan, and even my mother. What Logan found was explosive, though it took time to gather it all legally. Reed had been cheating on me with Morgan for 8 months, but she wasn't the only one. He'd also been having an affair with his coworker Alyssa, who had no idea about Morgan. Logan had photos, hotel receipts, and even recorded phone calls where Reed was making plans with both women on the same nights. Morgan's fraud went far beyond the credit cards. She'd been forging my signature on checks, using my identity to get store credit, and had even tried to take out a loan in my name. Logan had documentation of everything. But the most shocking discovery was about my mother. She had been embezzling money from the church where she volunteered as treasurer. Small amounts over 2 years,
but it added up to nearly $15,000. She'd been using the money to pay Morgan's bills and fund her lifestyle. Logan also uncovered something that explained a lot about our family's dynamics. My mother had been telling people for years that I was mentally unstable and that Morgan was taking care of me. She'd been painting me as the problem child and Morgan as the responsible one, which was the complete opposite of reality. Armed with all this information, I spent the final weeks before the wedding setting up my contingency plans. I prepared paperwork to give 30-day notice on the shared lease with Reed. I gathered documentation to file complaints with the appropriate authorities. I prepared the contracts that would allow me to shut down the wedding if needed. I even hired additional security for the venue, telling them I was concerned about uninvited guests causing problems.
The night before the wedding, I had one final conversation with Kendra. She'd flown in early and could see that something was wrong, even though I hadn't told her the details. "Talia," she said, "you don't seem like a woman who's getting married tomorrow. You seem like a woman who's planning a war." I smiled at her. "You're not wrong. Do you want to tell me what's really going on?" I considered it for a moment, then shook my head. "Tomorrow, you're going to see something that might shock you, but I need you to trust me, okay? Whatever happens, just trust that I know what I'm doing." Kendra studied my face for a long moment. "Okay, but Talia, whatever you're planning, make sure you can live with it afterward." "I can live with anything," I told her, "except being treated like I'm worthless." So when I walked into that chapel and saw Morgan in my spot, wearing white, holding Reed's hand, I wasn't surprised. I was ready. When my mother grabbed my arm and threatened to have me dragged out, I wasn't shocked. I was prepared. When Morgan spit in my face and the crowd laughed, I wasn't broken. I was focused. Because for 3 weeks, I'd been planning for this exact moment. Every humiliation, every cruel word, every recorded laugh. It was all fuel for what came next. You see, what Morgan and Reed and my mother didn't know was that I'm not just responsible, I'm thorough. When I planned this wedding, I didn't just book vendors and send invitations. I protected myself legally. The venue contract was in my name only. The catering contract was in my name only. The photography contract, the flowers, the music, the alcohol, all in my name. I had paid for everything with my own money, and I had insisted on contracts that gave me complete control. My lawyer, Nina Tran, answered on the second ring. I'd used her services when I bought my condo 2 years earlier, and she was sharp as a blade. "Nina, it's Talia. I need you to make some calls." While I was on the phone, I could hear Morgan behind me telling everyone to ignore the crazy woman and that they should continue with the real ceremony. She was instructing the photographer to start taking pictures of her and Reed. What she didn't understand was that without any legal authorization or contracts in her name, none of the vendors had any obligation to serve her. Nina worked fast. Within 15 minutes, my phone was buzzing with confirmations. The venue manager, Grant, was walking through the chapel doors with 2 security guards. The caterer was packing up the food. The bartender was closing down the bar. The photographer was packing up his equipment. "Excuse me," Grant announced to the crowd, "but I need everyone to clear the venue immediately. The contract holder has terminated today's event." Morgan stood up, her face flushed with anger. "You can't do this. This is my wedding now." Grant looked at his paperwork. "Ma'am, according to our records, a Miss Talia Whitman is the contract holder and the only person authorized to make decisions about this event. She's requested that everyone leave the premises immediately." Reed tried to argue, "This is insane. Talia is just being a psycho because she can't handle that we're in love." That's when I walked back into the chapel. I was still in my wedding dress, but now I was smiling for real. "Oh, Reed," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I haven't even gotten started yet." I turned to address the crowd. "I want to thank everyone for coming to witness this educational experience. Before you leave, I have some information to share that you might find interesting." I pulled out printed copies of the group chat messages, the ones where they had planned my humiliation. I handed them to people in the front rows. For those of you who participated in planning this, I announced, you might want to review what you wrote. Screenshots have a way of lasting forever. The first thing I shared were excerpts from the printed group chat messages, the conversations where they had planned my humiliation in detail, discussing exactly how they wanted it to play out, sharing jokes about how pathetic I was going to look. I read Morgan's message aloud. I can't wait to see Morgan's face when she realizes everyone knows what a loser she is. Then Reed's response. She's gonna cry so hard, it's gonna be hilarious. The chapel had gone completely silent. Some people were looking at the printouts I distributed, their faces growing pale as they recognized their own cruel words. My mother was white as a sheet. Reed looked like he was going to be sick. Morgan was staring at me with pure hatred now. I continued. Let me tell you what's going to happen next. I turned to Reed first. Reed, you're going to receive 30-day notice on our shared lease. Since you can't afford the rent on your own, you'll need to find new arrangements. Reed started to protest, but I held up my hand. I'm also filing complaints with the appropriate authorities about your financial irregularities. Your company will be receiving documentation about discrepancies in client accounts that my private investigator discovered. Now I turned to Morgan. Morgan, you look beautiful in that white dress. I hope you enjoy it because it's the most expensive thing you're going to wear for a long time. You see, I know about your little credit card problem, the one you've been hiding from Mom. When I called my lawyer, I also called your credit card companies. Turns out when you used my address to get those cards, you committed mail fraud. That's a federal crime. Morgan's face had gone from flushed to pale. You're lying. Nina, I called out. My lawyer was now standing at the back of the chapel. Would you like to explain to Morgan what mail fraud penalties look like? Nina stepped forward. Mail fraud carries a penalty of up to 20 years in prison and up to $1 million fine. We have documentation of a Ms. Morgan Whitman using her sister's address to obtain credit under false pretenses. The crowd was getting restless now. People were whispering, trying to figure out if they should leave or stay. Some of Reed's groomsmen were edging toward the exits, but I wasn't done yet. Oh, and Morgan, I should mention that the private investigator I hired found some interesting things about your entrepreneurial activities. Tell me, how long have you been selling those stolen cosmetics from the boutique where you work? Morgan's face went white. What are you talking about? I pulled out a folder that Logan Vega had prepared for me. Security footage showing you taking merchandise from Bella's boutique over the past 6 months. Your manager, Mrs. Henderson, was very interested to see these photos. She'll be expecting you for a conversation Monday morning. That is, if you're not in federal custody by then. Reed tried to step forward. Talia, this is insane. You're making things up. I laughed. Am I, Reed? Should I tell everyone about Alyssa Boyd from your office? You know, the other woman you've been sleeping with, the one who has no idea about Morgan? Now it was Reed's turn to go pale. Several people in the crowd gasped. His brother Dylan looked mortified. Or should I talk about the money you stole from your company's client account? The $5,000 you took to pay for Morgan's credit card bills? I'm sure your boss, Mr. Peterson, would love to know where that money went. Reed started backing away from me. You can't prove any of that. I smiled and held up another folder. Receipts? Hotel receipts? Restaurant receipts? Bank transfers? My private investigator is very thorough.
The chapel was in complete chaos now. People were pulling out their phones, but not to record my humiliation anymore, to capture this complete destruction of Reed and Morgan's lives. The tables had turned completely, but I still had one more card to play. Now, Mother, I turned to Celeste, regarding that loan where I'm a co-signer, I'll be consulting with my attorney about my legal options. The financial irregularities I've discovered may affect my ability to remain responsible for that debt. My mother's face crumpled. Talia, please, you can't do this to me. I'm your mother. Are you? I asked, because a mother wouldn't conspire with one daughter to humiliate the other. A mother wouldn't call her own child worthless and pathetic. A mother wouldn't steal money from her church to fund her favorite daughter's lifestyle. The gasp that went through the chapel was audible. Several of the older church members who were present looked horrified. "That's right," I continued. "Mrs. Harmon, Mrs. Williams, Mr. Chen, you all trusted my mother with the church treasury. She's been stealing from you for 2 years, $15,000 total. The district attorney's office has been very interested in the evidence I provided them." My mother collapsed into a chair. "How did you? How could you?" "How could I discover that my own mother is a thief and a conspirator?" I asked. "The same way I discovered everything else, by paying attention, by investigating, by refusing to be the victim you all expected me to be." I looked around the chapel one more time. The laughter had died completely. People were staring at me with a mixture of fear and awe. Some were already heading for the exits, clearly wanting no part of what was happening. "You know what the funny thing is?" I said to the remaining crowd. "You all came here expecting to watch me get destroyed. You brought your cameras, you prepared your social media posts, you were ready to share my humiliation with the world. But instead, you got to witness something much more interesting. You got to see what happens when someone who's been underestimated their whole life finally decides to fight back." I paused and looked directly at Morgan, who was now crying and clutching Reed's arm. "Morgan, you asked me earlier if I had anything to say about you and Reed finding real love. I do have something to say about that. You're going to discover that real love doesn't involve destroying someone else to get what you want. Real love doesn't involve fraud, theft, and conspiracy. What you and Reed have isn't love. It's mutual selfishness and cruelty. And that kind of relationship, it destroys itself." Reed tried one more desperate move. "Talia, please, we can work this out. I made a mistake. I love you, not her." My mother's mouth fell open. "You can't do that. I'll lose the house." "You should have thought about that before you decided to help humiliate your own daughter. But don't worry, I'm sure Morgan can help you out. Oh, wait, she's going to be dealing with federal charges."
The chapel was in complete chaos now. People were trying to leave, but many were stopped by their own curiosity about what else might be revealed. The security guards I'd hired were ensuring an orderly exit, but not confiscating anyone's phones. That would have been illegal and unenforceable. Reed tried one last desperate move. "Talia, please, we can work this out. I made a mistake. I love you, not her." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I started laughing, really laughing for the first time in months. "Reed," I said, "you think this is about you? You think I did all this because I'm heartbroken over losing you?" I shook my head. "Honey, you did me the biggest favor of my life. You showed me exactly who you are before I made the mistake of legally binding myself to you." I looked around the chapel one more time. "You all thought you were going to watch me get destroyed today. Instead, you got to watch me get free." I turned to leave, then paused at the chapel doors. "Oh, and one more thing, Morgan. That white dress you're wearing, it's actually my backup wedding dress. I had it altered to fit you perfectly. I'd been planning this for 3 weeks, ever since I saw you and Reed at dinner. The spit in the face was just the confirmation I needed that you're exactly as horrible as I thought you were." The silence in the chapel was deafening. I walked out of that venue, got in my car, and drove to Kendra's hotel. She was waiting in the lobby with a bottle of champagne and a huge smile. "How did it go?" she asked. "Better than I could have ever imagined," I said. The aftermath was even more satisfying than the confrontation itself. Within a month, Reed had received his 30-day notice and was served with documentation about the financial discrepancies. Morgan was contacted by federal investigators about the mail fraud. Turns out she'd been using my address for far more than just credit cards. My mother's financial situation became untenable when I withdrew my cosigner status through legal channels, and she eventually had to sell the house and move in with her sister in Ohio.
But there was so much more that unfolded in the weeks following what people started calling the wedding revenge heard around the world. The first domino to fall was Reed's job. When his boss, Mr. Peterson, received the evidence about the financial irregularities, Reed was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Eventually, the company pressed charges for embezzlement. Reed found himself facing not just unemployment, but potential legal consequences. The second domino was Morgan's world gradually imploding. The boutique where she worked conducted an internal investigation after receiving anonymous tips about inventory discrepancies. The federal mail fraud investigation took months to build, but eventually, Morgan was charged. She was also charged with retail fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud. But the most dramatic fallout was what happened to my mother. When the church board was provided with evidence of financial irregularities, they conducted a full audit. What they found was shocking even to me. My mother hadn't just been taking small amounts. The pattern of financial manipulation went back years. The scandal destroyed what was left of my family's reputation in our small town. The local newspaper ran the story with the headline, "Local Family's Wedding Day Fraud Exposed." My mother's mugshot was on the front page. Within 2 weeks of a wedding that wasn't, I started getting calls from people I hadn't heard from in years. Suddenly, everyone wanted to tell me their own stories about Reed, Morgan, and my mother. It was like my public revenge had given others permission to speak up about things they'd witnessed but never reported. My high school friend Michelle called to tell me she'd seen Reed with Morgan at a motel 6 months ago but hadn't known how to tell me. My neighbor, Mrs. Garcia, mentioned that she'd noticed Morgan coming and going from my apartment when I wasn't home, using what must have been a key Reed had given her. Even my father, who'd been divorced from my mother for 10 years, reached out to tell me he'd suspected she was stealing from the church but hadn't had proof. The most surprising call came from Alyssa Boyd, Reed's coworker and his other affair partner. She'd heard about the wedding incident through mutual friends and wanted to thank me for exposing Reed's lies. It turned out he'd been telling her that he was single and that I was just a crazy ex-girlfriend who was stalking him. He had me completely fooled, Alyssa told me. I thought you were this psycho woman who couldn't let go. I had no idea he was engaged to you and cheating on both of us with your sister. What you did was brave, Talia. You saved me from making the same mistake you almost made. But the most satisfying aftermath was watching Morgan and Reed's perfect love fall apart in spectacular fashion. Without me as a common enemy to unite them, their relationship crumbled within a month. It started when Morgan realized that Reed was broke. With his job gone and facing legal bills, he couldn't maintain the lifestyle he'd been promising her. She had expected to move into a nice apartment with him, maybe even buy a house eventually. Instead, he was living in his childhood bedroom at his parents' house, working part-time at a grocery store. Morgan, meanwhile, was facing her own financial ruin. With criminal charges pending and legal fees mounting, she couldn't afford her apartment. She had to move back in with my mother in Ohio, where they both worked minimum wage jobs and shared a cramped 2-bedroom apartment. Kendra, who had stayed in touch with some of our mutual friends, kept me updated on the drama. Apparently, Reed and Morgan started fighting constantly. Morgan blamed Reed for ruining her life by getting her involved in the fraud schemes. Reed blamed Morgan for being greedy and pushing him to steal from his company. They broke up and got back together 3 times in 2 months, each breakup more dramatic than the last. The final breakup happened when Morgan discovered that Reed had been trying to contact me through social media, begging for forgiveness and asking if we could work things out. She flew into a rage and showed up at his parents' house, screaming at him in the front yard while his neighbors watched. The police were called and Morgan was arrested for disturbing the peace and trespassing. That was the last time they spoke to each other. Meanwhile, my life was transforming in ways I never could have imagined. The story of my wedding day revenge had gone viral on social media, but not in the way Morgan had planned. Instead of being humiliated, I was being celebrated as a woman who refused to be victimized by people who didn't deserve her. Women from all over the country started reaching out to me through Facebook and Instagram, sharing their own stories of betrayal and asking for advice on how to handle cheating partners or toxic family members. A blogger named Rachel Stevens wrote an article about me titled "The Woman Who Turned Her Worst Day into Her Best Revenge," which was shared over 100,000 times. A podcast called Betrayed But Not Broken interviewed me about my experience. Several magazines reached out, asking to feature my story. Suddenly, I wasn't the pathetic woman who couldn't satisfy my man. I was the woman who refused to be destroyed by people who didn't deserve me. 6 months later, I moved to Portland to be closer to Kendra. I started a new job at a tech company, making more money than I ever made before. I bought a house with a view of the mountains. I adopted a dog named Justice that greets me every day like I'm the most important person in the world. And Reed? He moved back in with his parents after the eviction. Last I heard, he was working at a call center and driving a 15-year-old Honda because he couldn't get car insurance at a reasonable rate. Morgan plea bargained the federal charges down to restitution and community service, but she'll be paying off her debts for the next decade. She moved to Ohio with my mother, where they both worked minimum wage jobs and shared a cramped 2-bedroom apartment. The family members who laughed at my humiliation, they tried to reach out after they saw how well things turned out for me. But I had nothing to say to them. I'd learned that blood doesn't make you family. Loyalty does. A year later, I met someone new. Grant, yes, the same Grant who managed the venue that day, asked me out for coffee. He'd been so impressed by how I handled the situation that he'd been thinking about me ever since. We've been together 8 months now, and he treats me like I'm precious. He knows the whole story, and he says it's one of the things he loves most about me, that I don't let people walk all over me. Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about what I did to Reed, Morgan, and my mother. The answer is no. I don't feel guilty about protecting myself from people who wanted to destroy me for their own entertainment. I don't feel guilty about having the strength to fight back when everyone expected me to crumble. What I did that day wasn't just revenge, it was liberation. I liberated myself from a family that didn't value me, a fiancé who didn't respect me, and a life that was built on pleasing people who would never be pleased. The woman who walked into that chapel expecting to get married was weak, eager to please, willing to ignore red flags to keep the peace. The woman who walked out was strong, self-reliant, and completely done with other people's expectations. They thought they were destroying me that day. Instead, they set me free.